She stood at the mirror in 1954, cold cream jar open, reaching for lipstick before the car pulled into the driveway. Nobody taught her that trick. Every woman just knew. This is Clara's American Attic territory, the world of post-war homemakers who never wrote their methods down in one single book because they never needed to. I want to walk you through the real rituals passed mother to daughter with no manual at all, cold cream to charm school to the girdle drawer. Near the end, I will tell you about a list of wifely rules people swear came from a real 1950s textbook, and what historians actually found when they went looking for it. The ritual started the same way in 1,000 different kitchens and bedrooms across the country. A woman sat down at her vanity, unscrewed a heavy glass jar, and worked a thick white cream into her cheeks and forehead with slow, upward strokes. It was not vanity the way people mock it today. It was the 5 minutes of the day that belonged to her alone, and every homemaker in 1953 understood the difference. Pond's built an entire advertising empire on this 5-minute habit. Their campaign recruited real society women and debutantes to say their engagement glow came straight from the jar, cleanse, massage, wipe away, pat dry, night after night. It sounds like simple marketing now, but it worked because it promised something bigger than skin. It promised a version of yourself worth waiting for, and that promise is exactly what made the next trick so easy to sell right alongside it. Here is the part that gets left out of the nostalgia. Cold cream was not just about romance, it was thrift dressed up as glamour. A single jar lasted weeks if a woman used it sparingly, and the ritual doubled as the only real face washing most women did, since running hot water and store-bought cleanser were still a luxury in plenty of post-war households. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew exactly how far one jar could stretch. Some women skipped the jar entirely and reached into the icebox instead. A washcloth wrung out in cold water, sometimes pressed against ice chips wrapped in cloth, was a common closing step believed at the time to tighten the skin before bed. Modern dermatology has never confirmed that cold alone does much of lasting value, and nobody should take a 1950s bathroom trick as medical advice today. But the instinct behind it, a woman closing her own day with a small private ceremony, never really left us. Cold cream also solved a problem nobody likes to admit out loud, the problem of makeup that had to survive an entire day without a single touch-up in most households. Pancake foundation, the same formula originally built for Technicolor film sets in the late 1930s, had become the everyday base under lipstick and rouge by the early 1950s. Taking it off properly at night was not optional. It was how a woman's skin survived wearing a mask every single day. By the late 1950s, the American cosmetics and toiletries industry had grown enormously from its modest post-war size, with widely cited estimates putting the market near $2 billion a year by 1960. That is not a niche hobby. That is a national habit stitched into nearly every household budget in the country. And once you understand how much money and belief was riding on these little jars, the next trick, the one involving actual hair, starts to make a lot more sense. Because the truth is, the face was only the beginning of the nightly routine, not the whole of it. A 1950s woman's evening ritual usually moved straight from the vanity table to the bathroom mirror, where an entirely different kind of engineering was about to happen, one that had nothing to do with cream and everything to do with tiny metal pins and a woman's own patience. Pin curls were an act of patience most women today would never sit through. Damp hair was wound section by section around a finger, pinned flat against the scalp with a bobby pin, and left to dry overnight under a hairnet or a folded scarf. A woman might sleep on a dozen small hard lumps against her pillow, just so she could wake up with a soft wave that looked effortless by breakfast. The scarf tied over the curlers was not just practical, it became its own quiet uniform. Women wore it to hang laundry, to run to the corner store for milk, to sit at the kitchen table over coffee, all while the actual hairstyle stayed hidden underneath until it was finished. It was, in a strange way, the opposite of how people show off unfinished projects today. The work stayed private until the reveal was ready. By midweek, most women needed a wash and set that did not require a salon appointment, especially in smaller towns where the nearest beauty parlor might be a bus ride away. So the bathroom became the salon. Rollers of every size lined the medicine cabinet, and a woman learned, through pure repetition, exactly which roller size gave which curl on her own particular hair. The Poodle Cut, that tightly curled close to the head style that dominated the middle of the decade, actually took its name from the fashionable poodle haircuts of the era, not the other way around. It was short enough to manage without daily help and full enough to look deliberate rather than plain, which made it the single most practical hairstyle a working homemaker could choose for herself. Toward the end of the decade, a new can appeared on dressing tables everywhere. Aquanet hairspray, introduced in 1956, let a woman lock a curl in place for an entire day of errands, church, and visiting without a single pin showing. It smelled sharp and sweet at once, and that smell became, for an entire generation of daughters, simply the smell of their mother getting ready. None of this hairstyling happened in isolation from money. A trip to a real beauty parlor for a wash and set could run a family several dollars every week, real money in a single-income household. Learning to set your own hair at home was not just a skill, it was a small act of household budgeting disguised as beauty. And that same instinct was about to turn into one of the biggest beauty crazes of the entire decade. Because if you could set your own hair, why not permit yourself too? Salons charged $8 to $15 for a cold wave perm, a real expense for most families. A drugstore box promised the same curl for a fraction of that price, and by the early 1950s, millions of American women were about to find out if a home perm could actually hold up against the real thing. Toni Home Permanent launched its national campaign in the years right after the war, and by the early 1950s, it had turned into something close to a cultural obsession. The ads featured real sister pairs, one with an $8 to $15 salon perm, one with a $1 to $2 Toni kit from the drugstore, daring readers to guess which twin had actually paid for the professional treatment. Here is the number that made the whole campaign land. A salon cold wave could run a household $8 to $15, while the home kit sat closer to $1 or $2 on the drugstore shelf. For a family watching every dollar after the war, that difference was not small talk. It was the difference between a beauty ritual you could actually afford every season and one you saved for a special occasion only once or twice a year. Giving yourself a home perm took real nerve the first time. The solution had a sharp chemical smell, the timing had to be exact, and a woman was gambling her own hair on a process she had only read about on the back of a box. Most women who tried it once described the same feeling afterward, a strange mix of relief and pride when the curls actually held. There was something quietly radical buried inside a $1 box of home perm solution. For the first time, a woman in a small town or a rural farmhouse an hour from the nearest beauty parlor could get a result that used to require an appointment, a bus fare, and an afternoon away from the children. It handed a piece of the beauty economy directly to the person who actually had to live in her own hair every day. Neighbors noticed, and neighbors talked. In small communities across the country, one woman's successful home perm often became the reason 3 others tried it the following week, passed along over a fence or across a kitchen table rather than through any advertisement at all. It vanished, but it worked, at least for the women who trusted their own hands enough to try. By the middle of the decade, the home permanent had done something bigger than change hairstyles. It had quietly proven that a mass-market product could stand in for a professional service and still earn a woman's trust. That same confidence, doing something at home that used to require an expert, was about to show up again in a completely different corner of the daily ritual, the hour right before a husband walked through the front door. Because hair and skin were only the visible half of the picture, the part any neighbor could see from the sidewalk on any given afternoon. The other half happened on a clock, timed almost to the minute, in nearly every post-war household in the country, and almost nobody talks today about how strange and how specific that daily timing actually was. Around 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon, in a suburban kitchen that could have been in Ohio or Pennsylvania or anywhere else, a woman would pause whatever she was doing. She would check the clock, glance at her hair in the hallway mirror, and reach for the good lipstick kept in the kitchen drawer, specifically for this moment, not the tube she wore during the day. The popular version of this story says it was all for him, fixing herself up so her husband would come home to a pretty wife and a warm dinner. But daughters who grew up watching their mothers do this, interviewed decades later in local oral history projects, described something different. They remembered it looking less like performance and more like a woman quietly putting her own face back on after a day spent entirely on other people. The apron came off around the same time the lipstick went on, and sometimes the whole house dress went with it, swapped for something a step nicer before the car pulled in. It was a full costume change built around a fixed deadline that nobody had to write on a calendar because the whole neighborhood ran on roughly the same schedule. Did your own mother or grandmother keep a quiet ritual like this one somewhere in the house? A certain lipstick, a certain hour, a certain version of herself she put on before the family came home? I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments, because these small private rules rarely made it into any history book at all. This ritual gets flattened today into a punchline, the idea of a woman anxiously primping for her husband's approval. But a fixed transition point at the end of a long day is not actually a strange idea. It is closer to what a modern person does, changing out of work clothes the moment they walk in the door, marking the boundary between one part of the day and the next. The etiquette writers and advice columnists of the era leaned hard into this moment, publishing endless variations on the theme in magazines that landed in millions of mailboxes every month. Whether every single woman actually followed the advice to the letter is far less certain than the magazines made it sound. And that gap between the printed ideal and the real, messier household is worth sitting with for a moment. Because the truth is, most homes did not run like the magazine photographs. Some evenings dinner was late, some evenings the lipstick never made it out of the drawer at all, and the real skill being passed down was not perfection. It was knowing how to walk back into your own life looking like you had a plan. That same skill, presenting a practiced version of yourself on command, was being taught quite literally in classrooms to teenage girls across the country. Patricia Stevens ran one of the largest charm school franchises in the country through the 1940s and into the 1950s, with locations in dozens of American cities. These were not exclusive finishing schools for the wealthy. Did anyone in your family teach you a specific trick about posture, walking, or presentation? Share it in the comments. Ordinary teenage girls signed up, often through a course hosted right inside their local department store, to learn posture, makeup for their particular face shape, and how to walk into a room. The book on the head trick actually happened, and it was not a myth or a joke. It was a genuine training method borrowed straight from professional modeling schools. A girl would balance a hardcover book flat on her head and practice walking the full length of a room without letting it slip, over and over, until an upright spine and a level chin became automatic instead of effortful. Voice training was part of the curriculum too, and it is the piece almost nobody remembers today. Instructors worked with girls on pitch and pace, teaching them to lower a naturally high or nervous voice and slow down a rushed one, because a controlled voice was treated as being just as much a part of a polished presentation as a well-set curl or a straight stocking seam. Girls practiced laughing and smiling in front of a mirror too, adjusting exactly how wide a smile went and how a laugh sounded, because an unpracticed reaction was considered just as revealing and just as fixable as a stray hair. It sounds almost theatrical from a distance of 70 years, and in a way it was theater, a young woman rehearsing the role she was about to spend a lifetime performing in public. Quick reminder before we keep going, because it connects directly to what is coming a little later in this video, that list of supposed wifely rules from a real 1950s textbook that people still share online today as if it were a photograph of an actual page. We are getting close now to the part where I tell you exactly what historians actually found when they went digging for the original source. Charm school was not free. And it was not universal. Plenty of girls in rural areas or tighter budget households never set foot in one. But its ideas spread far beyond its own classrooms anyway, repeated in magazine columns, in mothers' advice to daughters, in home economics classes that every public high school in the country offered as a standard part of the curriculum by the 1950s. All of this training, the posture, the voice, the practiced smile, fed into a silhouette that was not actually optional in the way a hairstyle was. Underneath every carefully composed outfit sat a foundation garment doing serious physical work, and that garment came from a very specific and, at the time, genuinely controversial fashion decision made an ocean away in Paris. During the war, silk and nylon had gone to parachutes and other military supplies, and stockings became nearly impossible to find in stores. Women adapted with a trick that sounds almost unbelievable now, using leg makeup to fake the look of stockings entirely, then taking an eyebrow pencil and drawing a straight line up the back of each bare leg to fake the seam. By the early 1950s, nylon stockings were back on the shelves, but they were still precious enough to protect carefully. A run in a stocking was a small emergency, and the fix nearly every woman knew was a dab of clear nail polish, which stopped it from spreading any further, letting one pair last through several more wearings instead of getting thrown away after one snag. Keeping that seam perfectly straight up the back of the leg was its own small daily performance, something drilled into girls from a young age at home. Women checked each other's seams the way people today might check for spinach in their teeth, quickly, silently, as a small act of looking out for one another before walking into church or a social gathering. Good stockings were saved, quite literally, for good, meaning church, visiting, and any special occasion where a woman might be seen and quietly judged by the neighbors. A separate, older, more run-prone pair was kept specifically for housework and errands, so the household budget stretched further, and the nicer pair stayed presentable for months longer than it would have with daily wear. Mending extended well beyond stockings. Turning a worn shirt collar inside out and re-sewing it, or replacing frayed cuffs on a husband's dress shirt, let a family present a fresh-looking wardrobe on a fraction of what buying new clothing would have cost. These were skills taught explicitly in home economics classes, treated with the same seriousness as cooking or budgeting a grocery list. Every one of these stocking and mending tricks got repackaged in magazines and advertisements as glamour and know-how rather than what it actually was underneath, which was careful, constant household budgeting. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, that looking put together and having very little money were not contradictions. They were two sides of the exact same daily skill. All of that careful thrift sat directly underneath a silhouette that was, by design, not thrifty at all. The hourglass shape everyone associates with the era used yards of extra fabric and a serious piece of structural engineering underneath. And it came from a single, deliberate, and at the time genuinely divisive decision made by one French designer right after the war ended. Christian Dior unveiled his new look collection in Paris in 1947, built around a tightly cinched waist, a full skirt using yards of fabric, and soft, rounded shoulders, a dramatic reversal from the boxy, fabric-rationed wartime styles that had come before it. Within a few years, it had become the dominant silhouette for American women too, the visual template the entire following decade was built on. That particular silhouette did not simply happen on its own, out of nowhere. Underneath the skirt sat a girdle or a waist cincher, an elastic and boned garment made by companies like Playtex and Warner's, doing the actual physical work of pulling the waist in and holding the whole shape together for an entire day of standing, walking, and housework. Here is what surprises most people. The new look was genuinely controversial when it debuted, not universally beloved. Some critics at the time called it wasteful for using so much fabric so soon after wartime rationing, and some women who had spent years in looser, practical factory clothing during the war pushed back hard against a return to restrictive corseting. Wearing a girdle all day was, by every honest account from women who lived it, physically uncomfortable. It restricted breathing, it dug in at the waist during a long day of bending and lifting and cooking, and yet it became close to a daily requirement for any woman who wanted to be seen as properly dressed in public. Comfort and appearance were simply not weighed against each other the way they are now. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, and the girdle is a perfect example. Advertisements sold it purely as glamour, a path to the perfect hourglass figure. Almost nothing in the public advertising acknowledged the physical discomfort directly, even though private letters and later interviews make clear that women absolutely felt it and talked about it among themselves. By the late 1950s, some of that pressure was already quietly starting to loosen. Quite literally, as slightly softer foundation garments began appearing on shelves alongside the older, stiffer styles. The full unwinding of the girdle and new look standard would not really happen until the following decade, but the first small cracks were visible if you knew where to look. So, the shape of a 1950s woman from the outside was a full skirt, a cinched waist, and a soft, rounded shoulder line built entirely on fabric and engineering most people never saw. But there was one more layer to the whole presentation, the one that showed up first and left last, the color on her mouth, and it carried a meaning that had nothing to do with vanity at all. Now, the list. You have almost certainly seen it shared online, the one that claims to be a genuine excerpt from a 1950s high school home economics textbook, with instructions telling wives to have dinner ready, never complain, and greet their husband warmly at the door no matter what kind of day they'd had. It gets passed around as an outrageous, verified historical document. Here is what historians have actually been able to confirm after searching for it. Nobody has ever traced that exact list back to one single, verifiable 1950s textbook in the form it circulates today. It appears to be a composite, pieces stitched together over the decades from real advice columns, real etiquette guides, and real advertisements, but blended into something more extreme and more absolute than any one of those original sources actually said. That does not mean the underlying culture was invented. Real advice columns absolutely did urge wives to greet husbands cheerfully and keep the home pleasant. That part is well documented across the women's magazines of the decade. What is missing is proof of the single, rigid textbook version that gets forwarded today as if it were a photograph of an actual page. This matters for a bigger reason than just getting a fact right. Treating the exaggerated version as gospel flattens real women into a cartoon, either a perfectly obedient housewife or a silently oppressed victim, with no room left for the actual texture of their lives. The women behind these rituals were doing something far more complicated than following a script handed down from a textbook. They were managing a household budget, raising children, keeping up with neighbors, and yes, absolutely, navigating real social pressure to look and act a certain way. But they were also making thousands of small daily choices: which lipstick, which curl, which fabric to turn inside out and reuse, that had nothing to do with any rulebook and everything to do with their own judgment. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud, and that is really the whole point of this channel. The real rules were never written on any single page anyone could photograph and share online. They lived in kitchens, in bathroom mirrors, in 5-minute rituals passed silently from a mother to a daughter who never once needed a textbook to learn them. One thing did have a genuinely documented, verifiable origin, though, and it might be the most surprising trick in this entire video because it was not about romance or thrift at all. It was, of all things, treated as a patriotic duty during the war, and that habit never fully let go of its meaning even years after the fighting ended. During the Second World War, the U.S. government and cosmetics companies actively promoted lipstick as a morale booster, part of what advertising of the era openly called keeping up appearances for the sake of the country. While many cosmetic ingredients were restricted under wartime rationing, lipstick production was deliberately protected because a well-put-together face on the home front was treated as a form of resolve. That wartime idea, lipstick as a small act of defiance and resolve, carried directly into the 1950s, even after the reason for it had technically disappeared. A woman putting on lipstick before facing the day was not just decorating herself. In the cultural memory of that generation, it echoed a habit that had once been framed as something closer to civic duty. This is part of why the advice to never let your husband see you without lipstick sounds so extreme to modern ears, but felt almost unremarkable at the time. It was not really about hiding from him specifically. It was about a woman never letting herself be caught looking like she had given up, a standard she mostly held herself to rather than one enforced from outside. Red was the dominant lipstick shade through most of the decade, bold and entirely unapologetic, a genuine departure from the paler, more muted lip colors that had been fashionable in earlier decades. It took real confidence to wear that much color on your mouth every single day, and for plenty of women, that confidence was the entire point. This is where I will say plainly, because it matters, that none of this is advice about what to do with your own skin or face today. These were the beliefs and habits of a specific era, some of them charming, some of them genuinely uncomfortable, and looking at them clearly means neither copying them blindly nor mocking the women who lived them. The lipstick habit also shows up, again and again, in the oral histories collected from post-war suburban neighborhoods, the kind gathered by local historical societies from women who actually lived through it. Daughters remember it most vividly, that specific tube kept in a specific drawer, brought out at a specific hour, a small object carrying an enormous amount of memory inside it. All of these rituals, the cream, the curls, the seams, the girdle, the lipstick, add up to something bigger than a beauty routine. They were a language, mostly unspoken, that an entire generation of women used to say something about themselves without ever having to say it out loud. And there is one more piece of that language still worth uncovering before we close this out. Buttermilk and egg white treatments were common in plenty of farmhouse kitchens through the decade, mixed up and applied to the face or hair by women who had grown up watching their own mothers do the same thing. These were kitchen cabinet beliefs passed by word of mouth, not medically tested treatments, and nothing about them should be read as advice for today. What matters here is what they reveal, a resourcefulness that treated the kitchen and the vanity table as the exact same room. This is worth saying clearly, because it is easy to romanticize. Whatever a woman in 1953 believed about a kitchen cabinet treatment, none of it was tested the way modern skincare is tested, and none of it should be understood as a recommendation. The value in remembering these habits is historical and human, not medical, and that distinction matters more the further we get from the decade itself. What is genuinely interesting, and where a real, live, modern conversation actually exists, is the question of simplicity itself. Some contemporary skincare commentary has revisited whether older, minimal-step routines might have been gentler on certain skin types than today's crowded, many-product regimens, a discussion about routine philosophy and marketing, not a medical claim about any single ingredient curing or treating anything. It is a strange kind of full circle, honestly, the sort you do not see coming. A ritual that started as thrift, one jar of cream doing the work of an entire modern shelf of products, has ended up being re-examined today, not as an outdated relic, but as a genuinely interesting question about whether more steps ever really meant better results in the first place. Charm school posture, the practiced smile, the voice training, all of it has quietly resurfaced too, in a different form, among a newer generation drawn to slower, more intentional routines and what people now call quiet rituals. Nobody today is required to balance a book on their head, but the underlying instinct, taking 5 deliberate minutes for yourself inside a busy day, clearly never actually went out of style. Even the home perm has its modern echo, in the wave of at-home beauty products and tutorials that let people bypass a salon appointment entirely from their own bathroom. The specific brand names have changed completely, but the basic promise that a woman does not need to wait for an expert's permission to take care of herself is exactly the same promise Toni was selling with those twin sisters 70 years ago. So when you line all of it up, the cream, the curls, the seams, the girdle, the lipstick, the posture lessons, none of it was really written down in one place because it did not need to be. It moved the way the most important things usually do, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, one careful 5-minute ritual at a time, and it built a version of confidence that had almost nothing to do with anyone else's permission. The attic remembers, even when we forget, and that is really what all of this comes down to. Every jar, every pin curl, every straight stocking seam was a small, private decision made by a woman who was never going to get credit for it in any history book, and that is exactly why it is worth pulling back out into the light now, one ritual at a time. When I think about that woman at her mirror in 1954, cold cream jar open, reaching for her good lipstick before the car pulled in, I do not see someone performing for an audience. I see someone who had built, out of nothing anyone ever handed her in writing, a whole quiet architecture of self-respect, 5 minutes at a time, every single day of her life. If this pulled you back into your own grandmother's bathroom for a minute, that is exactly why this channel exists. And there are plenty more of these unspoken rituals still waiting up in the attic. Tell me in the comments which one of these you remember from your own family. Subscribe if you want to keep digging through this with me, and I will see you in the next one.